Back. We're going to begin the afternoon sessions. This next panel is called Staging the Apparatus, and it is going to be chaired by educator and designer Scott Sørli. So I'm going to just briefly introduce Scott and then hand the floor over to him. Scott's transdisciplinary practice unearths the moments when form and matter engage the economic and political forces that produce the city. As well as serving on the board of YYZ Artist Outlet for 6 years, he was co-curator of Convenience, a window gallery that provides an opening for art that engaged, experimented, and took risks with architectural, urban, and civic realms. Sørli has an extensive exhibition, publication, time-based programming, and architectural practice. He's also chair of the City of Toronto's Peace Subcommittee of the Nathan Phillips Square Community Advisory Committee, with professional degrees in architecture from Toronto, engineering from Waterloo, as well as a postgrad in design research from Michigan. Sørli has taught architecture at several institutions, most recently in Jakarta, Cambridge, and Toronto. So I guess join me in welcoming Scott, and then he'll run the show.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks for putting this conference together, and as well this particular session on staging the apparatus. I really appreciate the opportunity to moderate and ask questions from two artistic practices that I really admire the work of. And I also want to thank tech support and the cleaning staff for making this room presentable for the day. So what I'm going to do first is I'll introduce Hilary Mushkin. Hilary will be appropriately enough presenting digitally. So Hilary Mushkin is a visual artist and research professor of art and design at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology. She started Incendiary Traces, an art research and media initiative to reverse engineer the politics of landscape visualization. The initiative, which can be seen at incendiarytraces.org, situates civilian drawing and observation as collective visual practices parallel to the military's, while highlighting human subjectivity, gesture, and interpretation. To perform research, teams of artists, architects, and scholars observe and sketch at military bases, training grounds, engineering offices, and surveillance control rooms where global military and paramilitary leaders develop and use specialized landscape visualization practices. The project was recently the subject of a retrospective exhibition at the Pomona College Museum of Art with an accompanying publication, Incendiary Traces. It has also been exhibited at the NGBK Gallery in Berlin and Museo Ex Teresa Arte Actual in Mexico City. Mushkin's writing on the project has been published in Places Journal and KCET Artbound and will be included in the forthcoming book, Control Rooms, Nodes in the Networked City. So please welcome Hilary Mushkin.
Hi. Hang on a second. Sorry. Okay, I'm in the wrong place. Hold on. Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, wow.
Hi, Hilary. We can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. There was a little delay. Okay. Actually, I think I'm getting I can hear myself. So hang on. Let me try to adjust this really quick here. Hold on.
Hi, Hilary. We can hear you. Yes, we can.
I think I'm getting some, I can hear myself. So hang on, let me try to adjust this really quick here. Hold on.
Hillary, if you have the open stream, live stream, you have to pause it before we do that session. Otherwise, everything will be doubled.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you, Hillary.
Oh, no. Okay, let me see. Hello?
Yep.
Okay, Hillary?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay now? I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, this is perfect.
Okay, now I think that we had a little recursive audio there. Okay. All right. Thank you. So actually, I can still hear myself, but I guess I'll just live with that. All right, now I don't think it's quite so delayed. Thank you so much for inviting me, Simon, and I am really happy to be able to present my work to you all, and I really wish I could be there. It sounds like you guys are doing having a fascinating conversation today. But in any case, I'm happy to be here remotely and in whatever capacity is possible through the amazing technology we have today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my project, Incendiary Traces. And Scott, thank you so much for that introduction. That was super helpful for getting me started here. I have one more thing I need to figure out before I can get this to work, so bear with me. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about a chapter in the project Incendiary Traces, which Scott mentioned to you, which is focused on the largest reconnaissance drone training center in the world, which is at the U.S. Army base Fort Huachuca in southern Arizona. And this is an Army base that I visited with a group of artists and other arts professionals in 2016, almost actually a few years ago now. And just give me a second here because I want to make sure I've got myself organized. Before I launch into talking to you about Fort Huachuca, I just want to give you a tiny bit more background with Incendiary Traces. So as Scott mentioned, I'm an artist and I'm also a professor. And my work is focused on studying what I'm calling the instrumental political power of drawing. And what I mean by this is that drawing, and I'm actually not talking just about drawing in the sense that you might think of as like hand drawing or something like that, something that we sort of typically think of artists doing, but I'm talking about drawing in a very broadly, which can include all kinds of imaging practices. But I'm using the term drawing to talk about the fact that humans are in control of the way that the images that they make are constructed and how they look and what they represent. Even if you're using a machine, whether it's a computer or a camera or something else, you're a human, are still making all sorts of decisions about what kinds of images are created with those tools. And when we make images, those images are used by all kinds of authorities, including armed authorities, militaries, border agencies, police, also other kinds of authorities, economic authorities, all sorts of authorities, to establish knowledge and fact, and to use what they are asserting as factual representations to wield political power. So drawing sort of comes from this kind of what I think today we think of as something that comes from the field of art as something that's kind of, subjective and interpretive and emotional. And I'm taking that understanding of the idea of drawing and putting it in parallel with practices that are decidedly procedural and systematic and intentionally trying to diminish the role of human interpretation in order to establish a sort of fact of a truth which is intended to be beyond the subjective interpretation of any individual, and therefore to hold sway, power. So that I'm just kind of prefacing that to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, and then now we can talk a little bit about what's going on with in Fort Huachuca. I just pulled up a couple of other things here just to give you a little bit of background with incendiary traces. I've been to with this group. It's a loose collective that changes every time I go to a new place, of artists and scholars and architects, and we've visited a number of different places. This is the police surveillance system headquarters in Mexico City, where we drew in the observation room, and then they took all these photographs of us, even though we were not allowed to photograph, and they posted them all over their social media. And kind of, you can see by this image how the sort of, there are many recursive layers of control of the image here with watermarks and, and so on. And then this is a sketch that I made of their surveillance camera array. And this is just to give you a sense of the contrast between drawing as this, and the way that I'm sort of using this as a deliberately kind of messy subject, abstract.
Hillary, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Are you meaning to show us something? Because we're seeing your face.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Okay, something's happening.
Yeah, you'll have to go to screen share.
Yeah, we did this before, but I guess it didn't say. Let me see. Hang on. Screen share. This is in Skype or in?
In Skype.
Yeah, okay. Do you remember where it is now? Sorry, I lost.
There you go. He's coming to help you.
Give it a moment and you'll be getting some assistance. There we go. So open up your presentation and we can see it now.
Yeah.
Think of this as a surveillance tutorial.
That's fine.
That's excellent. Thank you, Hillary.
Okay, I'm going to go back.
Yeah, go back to the beginning of your imagery, please. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, this is what you missed, this fabulous slide. I know it's really was important that you saw that. I was talking about this image of Mexico City's surveillance center with the watermarks and all that sort of stuff on it briefly. This is a sketch that I was just talking about that I made that's of their surveillance camera array. But I want to actually move on now and just talk about, and this is at the U.S.-Mexico border. So talking now specifically about Fort Huachuca and the reconnaissance drone training facility there. So one of the things that I have to sort of just talk about briefly here before I get into this is that so there are various terms that people use to talk about what we colloquially talk about as drones. Okay, in the military, so military acronyms are used pervasively. When you go to military bases, you hear, if you talk to anyone who is involved in military contracting or anything, there's a lot of acronyms that are used. And military acronyms are kind of special language that give the people who use them a sense of camaraderie and belonging to a closed society. And when you talk to military people about drones, one of the first things they tell you is that they don't use and they don't like the term drone. The military refers to the terms UAV and UAS over drone for political reasons. The acronym military personnel stress implies human control of the aircraft, even though the pilot is not in the plane. The public has gotten used to the term drone for the same reason. It implies that the human oversight has been usurped by the machine. So I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward, and I'll just tell you that I use the terms interchangeably, UAV, drone. I don't really use UAS that often, just because I think it's more generic, and it refers to a bunch of different kinds of systems, not just kind of flying drones that we talk about. But I think that this is really important because when we think about different ways that people are talking about drones, they're talking about them with a particular kind of inclinations, or what Keller Easterling called dispositions, which are essentially selected, or it's a kind of bias that's inherent in the way that we represent the world, okay? And everybody has a bias, which is a subjective interpretation of the world. And these are often baked into systems. So, and they're baked into language, and they're baked into representation. So I'm going to just kind of put that out there, and we'll come back to that later. Okay, so first let me tell you about Fort Huachuca. So Fort Huachuca is in a desert region. It's 75 miles south of Tucson, Arizona, and 25 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. It's the largest reconnaissance UAV training facility in the world, where all U.S. military and NATO drone pilots are trained except U.S. Air Force. In April 2016, with Incendiary Traces, I brought 13 artists and other art professionals there to better understand the role of interfaces, imagery, and interpretation in contemporary war. So just to give you a little bit more information about this, in 2014, the U.S. Army took over a drone operation related to supporting Army ground troops from the Air Force, Navy SEALs, and Marines. At Fort Huachuca, trainees learned to operate General Atomics Gray Eagles. General Atomics is a major global military contractor, and they make also the Predator drone, which is probably the most popularly known in the general public. And the Gray Eagle is a successor to the Predator drone. So it's a more recent model, I guess. The Army's Gray Eagles operators work in the battle area. So, which means that they work actually close to where battles are happening. They're not directly in the combat zone, but they are close to the combat zone. And this is unlike the Air Force drone pilots, who are ones that we hear about the most, we hear a lot in the news about drone pilots who are flying drones from the Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, and that's where they're actually controlling drones that are halfway across the world. In the Army, they do not do things that way. They actually, they operate, as I said, directly from the battle area. For a few different reasons. And part of it actually is because of the cost of satellite relays. It's actually it's a lot less expensive for them to operate close to the battle zone. And so that's one of the primary reasons that they do it. And another reason is because of the sort of glitchiness of the satellite communication between the controllers who are in these control rooms and the drones themselves. They have a better connection when they're actually physically closer. So, and I'm bringing these things up to you because I want you to understand that even though I think civilians have a sense that the military technology, especially this kind of advanced military technology, is sort of incredibly all-powerful. And in fact, it is extremely powerful, but it's also fallible. And this is not something the military advertises because it exposes weakness. But if you start talking to anybody who actually works in the military or who develops military technologies, they acknowledge, because they're trying to actually improve the foibles of the technology. But from the perspective of an artist and somebody who's looking at sort of this kind of technology critically, it's useful to think about these foibles and to understand that there are cracks in the system, and that this kind of technology is just as prone to things that aren't working, to a certain kind of disintegration, a material disintegration that anything that a human would make with other kinds of materials, like an artist would make with sketching with a pencil and paper, that also sort of reveals a certain kind of fallibility of communication. So the army these military drone operators work in a network, communicating with ground troops and what is called the Tactical Operations Center, which is so there's a couple of different parties that are involved in communicating with the drone. There are ground troops, which are actually like people, who are Army personnel with their so-called boots on the ground. And then there is another control room that's called the Tactical Operations Center, where imagery analysts and commanders gather intelligence and communicate with the ground troops. So at Fort Huachuca, they're actually training to control the drones and to communicate with these other people in the network. And this is a training center where they sit together in an open training area with around 15 simulation stations. And here they practice operating the system. The operators of the drones work in pairs. One person controls flight, while the other person operates the payload attached to the aircraft. The payload could be something like a missile, a camera, or a radar transmitter used to visualize the ground. And their goals are to gather intelligence on a variety of targets, including identifying and locating enemy bodies, vehicles, buildings, and equipment, and, of course, attacking them. So here's one of the people that was part of the group, and where we were allowed to kind of test out these flight simulators. So UAV operator trainees practice using operator stations that are tricked out with simulation software, featuring virtual people, a market, bomb site, and moving vehicles overlaid on live or pre-recorded video footage shot from UAVs in the Arizona desert outside the training room. You can see here, this is the actual Arizona desert. And this is a sketch I made of that. And this is also just kind of remind you that whatever the camera sees is not an inevitable image. So there's a few strange things about this experience. The virtual foreign inhabitants, cars, and structures are rendered in very low resolution. People appear as 2D cutouts in a 3D space. You can see these little slivers here in the kind of middle bottom. The desert environment in which they're situated is represented by murky aerial video of a dry, brown, flat open space. Simulated and video environments are crudely integrated at best. Animated markets and people are placed near the video of the Arizona road, and virtual low polygon chunks representing foreign vehicles move along a blurred, low resolution vision of American asphalt. So, I mean, I have so much to say about these images, but I almost don't want to say anything about them because they sort of speak for themselves. We can talk more about that if you want to. Anyway, I guess that the quality and the way that these images are constructed suits the Army's stated training goals well enough. In real combat, the trainees will still encounter the represented people and places on the same type of screen with the same software and hardware interface. So it doesn't really matter how well defined the figures are. So outside of training, the simulation center by the Gray Eagle hangar and the airfield are 4 ground control stations that house these operation systems on site, where trainees practice real aircraft flight and payload operation. So we have some real Gray Eagles out there, and they fly them around in the Arizona desert. The ground control station architecture highlights the role the human body takes in operating these superhuman instruments. They're small mobile control stations that just large enough to contain seats, computers, monitors, a power generator, and related equipment for 3 drone operators. The power generator is really, really loud, and the space is dark and cramped, really cramped. The operators wear headsets to communicate with each other, as well as ground troops, air traffic control, and commanders. There's frequently crosstalk on the headsets. It's a very sort of, it's kind of like what you would imagine a flight center to be like in a closet. It's very cramped, and also a lot of information that's kind of like flying by in your ear, in front of you visually. The UAV operators work in concert with what are called the 35 Gulf imagery analysts. They're trained to look for what they call EEIs, or essential elements of information, which are otherwise, I would say, colloquially, we would think of them as clues. And they're also trained to track trends in large-scale events. They work with the drone operators to collect information from the camera payloads. This is reconnaissance, obviously. For example, to identify a recently buried IED, so an explosive device, right? The image analysts will look for disturbed earth, thermal traces, and footprints in the desert. So those are the kinds of traces or, clues that they might be looking for. The most common camera payloads on the Gray Eagles include an optical camera, color daylight vision, an infrared camera to reveal heat in black and white, a sparkle laser spotlight, which is only visible with night vision goggles and thus hidden from view, and a laser designator used in guiding missiles. However, these instruments are limited by atmospheric disturbances, obstacles on the ground, like buildings or natural obstacles, and inclement weather. So they don't always work. And of course, the military doesn't advertise that. That's not helpful for them they don't want people to know that. They're also tasked, so the military analysts, imagery analysts, are also tasked with what they call making a product that tells the so-called intelligence value of the intelligence and the surveillance and reconnaissance information that they've gathered. And they're basically supposed to sell the information that they've collected and the conclusions that they've drawn from what they've seen as a certain kind of knowledge or intelligence to commanders. And the reason that I want to stress this is because so in these so-called products can take the form of 3D simulations, maps, GIS, and LiDAR data taken from their aircraft. So this is particularly relevant because I think that, we have to remember that here is a perfect example of where certain kinds of drawing are directly related to and seeing and observing and kind of interpreting what one sees in an image are directly related to knowledge production, and that knowledge is then used to create a direct plan of action, which in this case includes military force. Just back to how this whole system works here. The ground troops remotely share a computer interface with imagery analysts and payload operators. The interface is called the Howarth-Wright, which allows a ground troop person to take control of the drone itself, and not the drone itself, but the camera on the drone if they're not getting the person who's controlling the camera from the control station to show them what they want. So it's like a kind of a tablet, but it's really heavy. And this is the space that the ground troops can see, which is similar to what the people who are in the ground control station can see. And I bring that up because I just want you to understand that there are, because the drone is operated remotely, people can see it people can control it from different places on the ground. Our hosts, while we were at the reconnaissance drone training facility, our hosts there, the people who run the place, made a point to tell us that there was a question that came up about gamers and whether, because it's often in the popular press, people often equate drone operators with gamers. That it's that the drone operators are sitting in some remote location and they don't really have any understanding of what's on the ground, and to them, operating these drones is basically the same thing as playing video games. And so our host there brought up the fact that it might seem like gamers would be perfect Army recruits to actually control drones. But their criticism as the people who would be hiring people to control drones is that gamers themselves frequently lack critical ability to communicate well via voice or speech. So the entire no-tech action of interpreting what you see on screen and heads up and articulating it quickly, clearly, and succinctly in words and images points to the important role that subjectivity and human interpretation and representation between these different controlling parties of the drone in the ground control station and the operations centers have. And it's also very, it also sort of visceral and highly mechanized space is there that they're really a part of.
Hillary?
Yes.
We're coming up on time. If you wanted to continue in the answer part of the session?
Yeah, I'm really happy to do that.
Okay, did you want to wrap this up with a concluding sentence?
Yeah. So I just want to say that our hosts were telling us this because they were joking that artists were perfect recruits. Because they were saying, you guys really know, you're sort of experts at interpretation of images. But however, I think the one thing that is really different is that artists, unlike the military, have been grappling with problems of representation for decades, including questioning accuracy, truth, and authority in images. So in this environment, we were symbolically, by drawing, we were symbolically kind of performing the role of being sort of interpreting human interpretation of a place with, by in really kind of absurd retrograde ways, by mapping 3D space to 2D space with traditional perspectival conventions. I use watercolor for fluid messiness and direct observation. Other people around, that were in my group were using pencil and marker with varying line widths, which could obviously be liabilities in military mapping. Other people were devising sort of rules and systems like, Fluxus and John Cage as the make a list recording all numbers spoken in the presentation. And so this is all to kind of, point out that the human agency is entirely in the foreground when we are engaging with images, and that unlike in contexts where the idea of an automated system foregrounds the machine as the thing which is in control in order to sort of mask the potential foibles of humanity, my project is intended to bring the fact that humans are in the driver's seat back into the. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing about the other projects and the conversation.
Thanks, Hillary. What we'll do is we'll have Elle Flanders present next, and then I'll have a question for Elle, and then follow up with a question for you, Hillary, and then we'll open up the questions to the audience. So if you hold for a few moments. While Elle is setting up, I'll introduce. Public Studio is a collective art practice of filmmaker Elle Flanders and architect Tamara Sawatsky. Public Studio creates large-scale public artworks, lens-based works, films, and immersive installations, grounded in the personal, social, and political implications of landscape. Public Studio's multidisciplinary practice engages themes of political dissent, war and militarization, and ecology and urbanization. Public Studio often works in collaboration with other artists. Elle Flanders, sitting to my right, completed her PhD at York in their recently created practice-based research visual arts program, and has mentored with some of the arts world's most notable artists, including Mary Kelly and Martha Rossler at the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Studies program and Rutgers University, respectively. Flanders has a strong history of community engagement and has created award-winning films and installations. Her long-standing interest in the socio-political realm and how it relates to landscape have led her, in collaboration with Sawatsky, to produce site-specific art installations, public art installations, that are immersive and that re-examine the role of audience as participant/witness. Please welcome Elle.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott, and thanks to everybody for being here on a Saturday, although who wants to be outside in Toronto in February? So I'm sick, so you'll forgive me. I'll be sipping tea and talking to you at the same time, and hopefully I'll make some coherent sense. As Scott said, I practice with my partner, Tamara Sawatsky. We practice together. We came together both in life as partners and then as well as artists. Tamara was a practicing architect when we met, and I was a filmmaker. I was mostly in the experimental world, in documentary film. I was also an activist. I've worked for years in lesbian and gay activism in Toronto. I've worked in anti-fascist work in Toronto, which was once necessary and sounds like it's necessary yet again. This is a project that Tamara and I were starting to work on around Moss Park in Toronto. And this is some architectural work of Tamara's, including she now does a lot of work on her own, so we both maintain our separate practices as well as working together. The first project we worked on together was called Road Movie. I was spending a lot of time in the Middle East. I'd grown up in Jerusalem, and Tamara came and joined me there. And we worked on a project in the West Bank, and we lived in Ramallah for a year. And we worked on a project in which we were tracing what are known as the apartheid roads in Palestine, in the West Bank. And essentially it's a system of segregated roads that keep Palestinians separate from Israeli settlers who are sort of zooming from Israel into the West Bank, into their settlements. And we decided that being on the ground was important at this stage in terms of trying to understand through stories and through these roads how things unfolded. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about where John left off this morning in terms of the idea of sort of separation and the separation of, he was talking object-subject, and I want to talk a little bit more about this kind of need now for perhaps a little bit more cohesion. So I think that's kind of where I want to look at through our work, and kind of also the concept of as above, so below, sort of a hermetic concept of both sky and earth. And so when we talk about drones, you'll see the movement of us from sort of the ground to the sky and back down to the ground again, and why that's important. So this is the project, this is where our practice becomes quite three-dimensional and immersive. We went from sort of more traditional film kind of screening in cinemas and theaters to film installation work. So here you can kind of see the thickness of the walls. They're presented on two sides. You have Israeli roads on one side and Palestinian roads on another. And we work with a sound artist by the name of Anna Frizz, who's very involved in sound, specifically around radio. So I know we had a little bit of a discussion this morning about radio, and radio art in Anna's world is an extremely important way of thinking about communication. Here we're using kind of these military loudspeakers that get used on the ground in Palestine, just sort of telling people when there's surveillance going on. You hear through the loudspeaker how people they're told how they need to move around. So Anna kind of replicated that in our project here. So I'm not going to go through it much more. I just wanted to give you the ground in order to understand why we moved to the sky and back down again. So this is a project called Under the Last Sky, and Under the Last Sky, it's based on it's a quote from the late Palestinian poet by the name of Mahmoud Darwish, who was the Palestinian poet laureate. And there's a poem that he has that talks about where do the birds fly when there is the last sky. And for somebody who lived under military occupation for most of his life, this became a kind of way of thinking about the sky as being sort of also occupied, which now has become more and more commonplace. So really this show was kind of, it was a meditation on the relationship between surveillance and photography, and really what we were trying to do was break it down to its very core. We wanted to do a history lesson in photography through understanding the apparatus of both drone and surveillance as a mechanism of photography. And what we started to look at were these silicone wafers, which I'll show you in a minute, which we etched and are etched as well. And silicone wafers have, I'll get to the silicone wafers, and then I'll go backwards. So these are the wafers that we etched. And the silicone, the etching of the actual semiconductors can be seen on the other side. And here's another rendering of that. So we became kind of interested in these silicone wafers and the use of etching and photolithographic etching as kind of this very primal, very early way of understanding photography, now used in some of the most highly sophisticated equipment, including drones and surveillance equipment. So just going back here, you'll see we placed these on a table with a mirror underneath so that you could actually see the reflection of those semiconductors. And on the top were the etchings of clouds and skies under which the U.S. military was conducting drone warfare essentially in secret. So we looked at skies over Yemen and skies in Afghanistan and skies in Pakistan. And what you'll see in this is a wall. These are redacted. At the beginning, you have a list of all of the strikes that occurred. This was research done by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, where they went into various locations and actually, through speaking to people, would try and record all the drone strikes that were happening illegally under Obama. in which obviously drone warfare increased exponentially. Now there's been a new article in The Nation, I don't know if anybody's seen it, about drone warfare in Somalia and the increase of drone warfare under the Trump regime. And it's being done by a reporter on the ground mostly. And now she's also discovered that the military is actually even somewhat unfamiliar with some of the drone strikes that are happening in Somalia because they're being conducted by the CIA. So here's just a sense of the wafers and the etchings. This was, if you can see in this, you see on the back, in the background there, you sort of see these vinyl strips on the wall. So what we decided to do was actually kind of go from the sky down to the ground and have a conversation with photographers working in Afghanistan at the time who were very much part of what was in fact happening and who were kind of recording the day-to-day lives. What Tamira and I think about our work is we sort of work in landscape, but we think about what we do around war as looking at the everyday in war instead of the spectacularization of war, which you see in most media. We kind of want to come down to the idea more of war in the everyday and how, you know, there's this very much a life that happens in the everyday that kind of gets missed because it's not sent to you in sort of spectacular images, and that's kind of where we find ourselves. So we wanted to have conversations with Afghani photographers, and this was a series. So what we did was we started to collaborate with them, and this was a series of photographs. This was actually a Dutch diplomat at the time, who was working in Afghanistan, and he was just taking sort of photographs of the everyday, and we started to look at these photographs of his from the perspective of how a surveillance or a drone might think about this as a nefarious activity. This was a guy changing a tire on his Jeep, which we then manipulated to kind of have this other how it might be seen otherwise from a surveillance vantage point. These were images of a dogfight. There's the unfortunate sport of dogfighting in Afghanistan done by often many ex-commanders of the military do this sport as a way of sort of keeping their machismo in check. And this was the work of an Afghani photographer who is a photojournalist, who we started to become friendly with and we wanted to collaborate more and more with, and we asked him if he would join us in this show, and he said yes. And we kept up a conversation over the internet, over email, over Facebook for a couple of years. And one day he sent me an email saying that one of the stories that he had shot, a photojournalistic story that he had done, was causing him grief with the Taliban, and that his life was in danger, and that he wanted to seek asylum in Canada, and would I help him? And so here we're going from kind of the sky, from surveillance, from this kind of investigation into drones to the ground, in which then Mustafa and I create this relationship and this friendship. And I like to think about this through sort of a lens of an ethics of photography, or as Ariella Azulay would call it, a citizenry of photography. Sort of what are the relationships that get created? And I just wanted to show you some of Mustafa's work. So in fact, he is here, and he has sought asylum, and he's been here now for a year. So we were able to bring him over. And this is just some of the work that he shoots. This was his everyday life in Afghanistan, in different areas. So I kind of wanted to move all the way from what Hillary was showing you as these sort of like, you know, I don't know what we call those 3D figures, the brown mush balls that exist in drone surveillance, and then take you right down to the ground to some of Mustafa's work. This was a story he did about the first woman taxi driver in Afghanistan. And this is one of my favorite little series. This is about, as he calls it, girls who become boys. So we have a sort of series of Afghanistan lesbians. And I just kind of wanted to bring that into the conversation. And then this was the piece that Simon really wanted me to talk about, so I'll get there and we'll be done. So this was a piece that Tamara and I did several years ago that was just kind of at the same time as Under the Last Sky, a little bit afterwards. This was commissioned by the Ryerson Image Center. And we were showing together with Harun Faraki, a great late artist, German artist, who did a lot of work around surveillance and certainly the military and in ways in which sort of the psychology of the military, some of what Hillary had sort of talked about a little bit in terms of thinking about gamers as either fit for military or not. And actually, Harun Faraki did a whole series that was part of this exhibition as well, that had traveled quite a bit, in which he looked at gamers, he looked at how gaming was being used by the military to help the psychology of people who had experienced trauma in war. So these were post-Iraqi soldiers, and they were using games as ways of trying to relive the trauma of the Iraqi war. Drone Wedding was a piece that Tamara and I did as a way of trying again to bring the idea of drone warfare back to Canada, back to where we live, back to our backyard, to try and understand, after we had done all this research, as many of you know, there were a series of Afghani weddings and that had been struck by drones, in which were targeted, not intentionally obviously, by drones in which hundreds of people were killed. And we kind of wanted to think about that in terms of our own backyard. So there was the Ryerson Image Center had this new media wall that was split into sort of a variety of screens. And you could use it in all sorts of different ways. And because we work so site-specifically, Tamara and I kind of came up with this idea in which we were looking at the media wall very much by the company who actually, in fact, built it, that works for the military as well. So much like the media surveillance room that you saw in Mexico City that Hillary was showing you, so too this media wall was built by a company that builds similar apparatuses. So we kind of already started from that place as artists. So this is a piece called Drone Wedding. What we did was it was a two-part piece. The first part of the piece was we staged a wedding in a very upscale neighborhood in Toronto. It was at a woman's house who's an art collector. She agreed to allow us to use her very beautiful backyard in which we performed a wedding, which we then filmed with drones. The reason we got to the drone camera was kind of an interesting one. Tamara had been sent an advertisement, a flyer, from an architectural firm that uses drones to photograph their architecture. So it was sent to her as an architect saying, hey, you know, we're drone pilots and we'll photograph your beautiful architecture for you with drones. So we thought, how could we use this in another way? And so we launched these drones and we filmed this wedding that we set up as a performance. So. The sound, again, is done by our friend Anna Frizz, the radio artist, and the sound is taken from, a lot of it is taken from the Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks release of the illegal drone strikes, American drone strikes. So a couple of notes about this. You don't have to turn this. You can leave this out. Thanks. Oh, I see. It cuts out when I speak. Uh-huh. So a couple of things about this to note. One was that the connection between some of this work that we had done previously that I showed you, Road Movie, this was also a direct result when we were in Palestine. Tamira and I had gone down to Gaza to witness the yet one more invasion by the Israelis of Gaza, where they were dropping bombs via drones, and there's been ongoing drone warfare for the past many years. And we actually witnessed sort of some of the bombs that were being dropped by these drones. And so we started to think that kind of led us eventually to this looking at the apparatus of the camera on a drone and thinking that through. The other thing that we noticed when we did this piece specifically was the woman who had the house. After we put together this piece, and it's put together randomly so that it's edited using randomizing software. So essentially, it's sort of a loop that is continuous, that's constantly pulling out images from what we shot. So we had several cameras on the ground. We had the drone in the air, and then we had a couple of other surveillance cameras set up around her house. And one of the things she said after she saw the piece was that she had been at this kind of what felt like this joyous occasion, this kind of nice performance piece at her house. And when she came and she watched this, she had this overwhelming sort of creep factor. And she kind of, for the first time, understood what surveillance meant, to have it reflected back to her through this, through these images and this mechanism. This is kind of that's a bit of a Hitchcock nod over there, but we'll talk about that later. And so she kind of, for the first time, felt like what it might be like to be seen as an other and seen from a distance and seen without one's knowledge. And I've forgotten his name, the Italian who presented earlier, Giovanni. When Giovanni was speaking about a world in which, he dreamt of a world in which there was no more privacy, of course, it chilled me to the bone, because I think that right now we're living in a world of big data, and we're living in a world in which there are people who control that information, and then there are the rest of us who are overwhelmed by information in a sort of morass, in a mess. It comes at us in sort of this fragmentary, disorganized way of which we have no control. And so I think that dream of a time of no privacy is just that, is a time in which, there will always be those who control our information and those of us who no longer have control, which we're obviously now in the midst of. So I'll leave you with that. This just continues, so I'll pause it there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do, Elle, is ask you a question with a preface at first. And the question will be about the structure of your practice and also the structure of your work. Simon put this panel together, and he titled it Staging the Apparatus for a reason. And it took me to Giorgio Agamben's definition of what is an apparatus, and I thought that that would be a good place to start the questions. Agamben summarizes an apparatus in 3 points. He says, one, that it is a heterogeneous set that includes virtually anything: discourses, institutions, buildings, police measures, philosophical positions, and so on. 2, it has a strategic function, and it is located in a power relation. And 3, it appears at the intersection of power relations and relations of knowledge. So, I mean, I really love your film, Elle and Tamara. And one of the, I feel uncomfortable part about the love that I have for this film, because my way into that film is through the architecture. I mean, that the set is Shim Sutcliffe's Weathering Steel House, and I think it's a wonderful way to see architecture in a new way, and not in plan, section, elevation, but through drones that is not a kind of banal documentary sense. Having said that, that's my way into this film. There are an enormous number of layers in the film, and so it's very obvious just the number of screens that we have. But then on top of that, there's the audio, which is layered as well. And so the piece itself functions as an apparatus in and of itself, and then the work that it does engages, let's say, a military, industrial, capitalist apparatus as well. So the piece operates on multiple levels. And I wanted to ask you about the structure of your practice, that it's collaborative and that it's multidisciplinary and open, and how that relates to the structure of the work that you do, and how that opens up possibilities that you wouldn't have had if you would have followed a more, let's say, traditional architectural or artistic practice.
Okay, well, the architecture question is for Tamira in terms of the more traditional practice.
Right.
I don't think I could say anything about anything I've ever done as traditional. I think coming from both an activist and a filmmaker background, working in documentary and experimental practice, always led me down this path. And I think there's always a place in which ethics entangles itself, for me, with aesthetics. And we're always playing with that, we're always working with that. It becomes the primary kind of question and focus of our work. I think because I grew up in Jerusalem, I was constantly surrounded by a question of war and ethics or a lack thereof. And so it was just sort of very much for me a logical and a ration. No, it's not rational. It's not rational at all. It's an emotional response to a world around you that is in constant flux and falling apart, and watching suffering on a regular basis. And so I think that became my response to it. I think when Tamira and I started practicing together, I think there were a whole set of questions that were not answered for her as a practicing architect at the time, that maybe we started to research more through our practice as collaborators. So I don't know if you want to talk to that. There's a mic right there. On the bottom, maybe?
I think it's... Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, I was a very traditional architect practicing very collaboratively in an office, and I think that carried over into our practice. I think architecture is collaborative in its natures, just as buildings are also multidisciplinary. So I think it was very natural for us to sort of think of a joint practice that way, as is filmmaking. Architects have skills, but they're also producers, and I think for the most part, how we think about involving other people is always about how to coordinate a large group of people, just as architects always do in the design and construction of a building.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask Hillary a question. I don't know if we can get Hillary up on the screen. And Hillary, can you hear us?
You have to unplug?
Give us a moment. And I just want to make sure Hillary can hear the question before I ask it. There we are. Hillary, are you? You can hear us? All right. So the other question, I mean, there's a question of, let's say, landscape between both of the presenters today, but also a question of aesthetics. And I was going to preface my question to you about the distribution of the sensible with Jacques Rancière's definition of political aesthetics, where he says that political aesthetics is a system of self-evident facts of sense perception that simultaneously discloses the existence of something in common that we share and the delimitations that define the respective parts and positions within it. And this apportionment of parts and positions is based on a distribution of spaces, times, and forms of activity, and that this distribution is politically determined. The question I have for you, again, is one of artistic practice. You have a similar way of working that's collaborative, but it also seems to me that the fact that your practice can be labeled an art practice opens up certain doors so that your art machine can face the military machine and engage that machine in a way that perhaps other practices wouldn't have that kind of permission. Would you want to talk about that? I mean, how did you even get the opportunity to go into a military base and draw it?
Yeah, it's a long process. So, yeah, actually, it's interesting when I present my work in context outside of the United States, I'm reminded about the fact that being American makes a really big difference in this case, actually. Because, in fact, I was inviting a group of people who were connected with the Arizona State University. And one of the people that wanted to join me is an Iranian citizen who's currently a graduate student at ASU. And the person who I was negotiating access with told me that, there was some negotiation about whether or not he could join us. It wasn't a point like, no, he can't come, but at the end it was, no, he can't come. So it was just, we were going to place they decided that it was not they would not let non-American citizens in there. And I guess just to sort of be totally, in the most practical sense of answering your question, what I do is typically call the public affairs department of places. There's always somebody who has to deal with the press that's part of these organizations. And that's where I start. And I sort of then pry open pathways for doing something that's not just a typical press visit, through building a relationship with the person that becomes my press contact, and kind of continually not taking up for an answer politely and trying to present, trying to find ways to have them understand or believe that there's some advantage to them hosting us. That's a big part of it too, which is that's why I mentioned think the guys who were presenting the drone stuff to us, they had a sense that maybe artists would be good recruits. They need to validate the time that they spend with us for themselves. Like, oh yeah, we're getting something out of this. The military thinks they're getting something out of this. And this is something that I've learned over years of having good conversations. From maybe the first one where the guy just told me, this was the 29 pounds Marine base, the guy just told me point blank, I can't I can't just let you come in here and draw someplace because that's not what I get paid to do. I need to tell you about the military day. And so I said, oh, okay, so can you take us someplace to draw while you talk to us for an hour? And he said, oh, yeah, let me think about where that would be. But his first response was no. So that's just like, so this is how I operate.
I like the French definition of the word draw, which is more active. It can be translated as a volley or an arrow that you would shoot. And it seems to me that the drawings that you do work for you, but they're useless to the military. And I'm really interested in that sort of uselessness deliberately being located. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
I like that you said located. Because that's really important to what I do, which is that drawing on site in those locations, to me, it's sort of that's sort of where that juxtaposition takes place. It's really more in the performance of drawing and the actual outcome of the objects themselves. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, and what's funny because it's not activist, and we don't show our drawings to the people that were hosting us, and I don't think, and I never, and I don't know that they really. I mean, nuances of what we're discussing are not part of the conversation that I have an entire conversation with them. So I'm not sure how directed it is. In ways, it's not really an activist practice in that sense. Maybe it's a more sort of meditative, I don't know, I'll use the word meditative with the word, and I appreciated that. Yeah. So I like the idea of practice, but I think that I'm aware of the limitations of that in my work.
Thank you. Simon, do we have time for a couple of questions from the audience?
I think it would be great to have maybe 2 questions from the audience.
And it'd be nice if it was one each for the artist practices.
Are there limitations regarding the use of drone close to the airport, in the military base, and also in the cities that you might learn because you were there? I'm talking about both questions. The case of that military base and the airport close nearby, and the use of drone from both sides of the border, and also from the, if you are, in your knowledge, limitations that are bringing about lately for the use of drone nearby airports close to cities.
That was for
I mean, actually, there are laws in the United States about that. I don't know, it probably varies according to where you are, but there are laws about that in the United States. I think that the law is that you can't fly a drone 5 miles from an airport. I probably would check that if you're actually could do it, because I don't remember what the distance is. And for military installations, they don't have. I don't know about what the rules are for flying drones near military installations. I do know that there are limitations on taking photographs, video, even drawing military installations. There are laws against that are varied. It's not a blanket statement that you cannot photograph or draw any military installation. In fact, there are some where on certain days when events are happening, you can not take an image, but in other days at the same place you can. So it's kind of complicated. But also I'm sure that it's the same in Canada as it would be here.
Right, thanks, Hillary.
Thank you.
Do we have another question? One perhaps for Elle and her Practice Public studio? I could easily ask one. I'm also really interested the subject of the wedding is so discomforting in the video. And it points to this question of metadata, that the program or the apparatus, let's just say, uses criteria of location and orientation and configuration as a criteria for assassination, and it happens to be by coincidence that this software can't tell the difference between a Taliban political meeting and the formation of a wedding or a funeral, for that matter. And I was wondering if you, Elle, would be able to talk a little bit about that kind of overlap in your film. I mean, there's a reversal for sure that it's North Toronto, pretty wedding, and then it's been reversed through that kind of surveillance technology. And I'm wondering, you're making a similar kind of, let's just say, spatio-temporal overlap between what's occurring here and what's occurring there, and that seems to me to be the subject of the piece.
Partially. I mean, I think partially what we're trying to do is a few things on a few different levels. I think one was obviously to think about what that inverse is, and the fact that, when we send surveillance and drones and, into the netherworld and we have no connection to it, and or our only connection to it is in a series of images that leave us nothing but kind of both mute and inactive and disinterested. I think that for us there was a part of this where we wanted to bring that back into an environment that was something closer to home, ultimately, literally, and in terms of our ability to connect to something that is quite disconnected. So it was definitely trying to function on that level.
And an emotional connection.
An emotional connection, and just also at a level of trying to understand how technology, just trying to shine a light a little bit on how technology functions and how surveillance functions, without an alertness to it. I think that we've all become inured, and even when we did this, which was 2013, 2014, that the few years even that have passed in between, we've seen sort of, an even greater cascade of images that have sort of leading to that same kind of inertia. So I think what we were trying to do was look at that and as a way of kind of poking maybe a little bit to say, if this is in our midst, what does that mean? What do we do? What do we do with it? So I think it was definitely trying to function on that level. It's a piece is now, it's now like practically 5 years ago, and it feels like it could be 20.
Or one.
Which is, we were talking at the very beginning, when Harwood did his introduction, he was talking about, how do we in fact slow things down? And I thought it was an interesting contrast with the next panel, which actually didn't even ask that question. It didn't stop to think, to breathe, we were just going to talk about apparatuses in which communication was going to happen, here as opposed to at a tertiary level. And so I think our job as artists is to take that time to stop, to think, to slow it down, and to actually think about each one of these images, whether they're random or not random, how we organize our thinking in general. And from that, how we try and create a new way of seeing, a new way of understanding something. I think Hilary, through drawing very slowly, I kept thinking of her drawing very much as, being an embedded photographer in a war situation. I mean, this is just so old in a way, in which painters and photographers were sent in to battlefields to record. And it was a kind of slowing down as a way of understanding. I don't know if anybody had a chance to see Stephen Andrews' beautiful work up at the McMichael that looked at the Iraq War through layering of images in which, you know, he then deconstructs the image for us through the news and how the news understood it, and journalism, and through a dot matrix. And I think that's our work. Our work is to try and take those dots and deconstruct them and slow things down. So I sort of took that message this morning quite seriously. And the second panel just kind of, you know, sailed right by. And it's just like, oh no, stop the data cascade.
Thanks, Elle. Hillary, did you want to just say one last thing with regard to this before we let you go?
I really wish I was there.
Yeah, we wish you were here too.
It's not the same. And I guess that's kind of what we're talking about.
Right.
Anyway, it's what to do. No matter how fabulous technology is, I'm not breathing the same room as you. All three of your coach, and you know, yeah. And anyway, but I'm really happy to be part of this, and to get to know your work a little bit. Elle was great. Scott, your kind of your philosophical association with both of our work was really great, and yeah, so thanks.
All right, thank you very, very much, both of you, Hillary and Elle.
Thanks.
Thanks.